The United States government has spent years and enormous political capital trying to prevent China's military from getting its hands on advanced American AI chips. Export controls, entity list additions, licensing requirements, diplomatic pressure, the entire apparatus of American technology policy has been pointed at one goal: making sure that Nvidia's most powerful AI accelerators do not end up inside Chinese military systems that could be used against American interests. But a bombshell report published just weeks ago has revealed that despite all of those efforts, China's People's Liberation Army has been successfully acquiring Nvidia chips anyway, repeatedly, over a period of years, through a sophisticated network of intermediaries that has consistently outmaneuvered Washington's attempts to stop it. The findings are not just embarrassing for American policymakers. They raise fundamental questions about whether export controls can actually work in a world where demand for advanced AI compute is high enough to motivate creative circumvention at scale. The research that exposed this situation was conducted by business intelligence firm Wirescreen, which analyzed more than 3,800 Chinese military and government procurement records to trace exactly how the People's Liberation Army has been obtaining Nvidia hardware. The scope of what Wirescreen found is striking. PLA units and military-linked institutions attempted to procure Nvidia AI chips approximately 540 times between 2019 and 2025. The chips being sought included some of Nvidia's most powerful and most restricted AI accelerators, including the A100, the A800, the H100, and the H800. In many cases, the procurement notices naming Nvidia products specifically were published directly through official Chinese military procurement channels, meaning this was not a covert operation happening in the shadows. It was openly documented in public records that anyone with access to Chinese government procurement databases could read. The network that the PLA used to acquire these chips is one of the most revealing aspects of the Wirescreen report, because it demonstrates how sophisticated and resilient the circumvention ecosystem has become. Wirescreen traced a procurement ecosystem involving 374 companies spanning PLA units, defense universities, state-owned enterprises, shell companies, and commercial intermediaries working together to move restricted hardware from American manufacturers to Chinese military end users. The system works by routing purchases through layers of intermediaries that obscure the ultimate destination of the chips. A Chinese commercial company with no obvious military affiliation places an order. That company either already has the chips in stock from a previous legitimate purchase, acquires them through a third-country intermediary outside the reach of American export controls, or obtains them through other channels that create enough distance from the American manufacturer to make legal enforcement difficult or impossible. The specific cases documented in the Wirescreen report and subsequent reporting by the New York Times and other outlets illustrate how the circumvention has worked in practice. Chinese universities performing military research acquired super micro servers equipped with sanctioned Nvidia AI chips, with public documents showing these purchases were completed in 2025 and 2026, well after the export controls that should have prevented them were in place. A Chinese Nvidia cloud partner procured 300 servers loaded with banned AI GPUs worth approximately $92 million. The U.S. government has been closing loopholes as they are discovered, including recently shutting down a pathway that allowed Chinese-owned subsidiaries located outside China to buy AI chips and then route them to Chinese entities, but the report makes clear that the controls have consistently introduced friction and shortages rather than achieving the complete cutoff that American policymakers intended. Nvidia's official response to the Wirescreen findings has been to dispute the framing and the practical significance of what was found. A Nvidia spokesperson told The Wire China that the suggestion the PLA relies on a few dozen second-hand GPUs is as silly as it is untrue, arguing that China has more than enough domestic chips for all of its military applications with millions to spare. This response reflects Nvidia's consistent position that export controls are counterproductive because they damage American chip companies commercially while failing to actually prevent China from accessing the technology through alternative means including domestic development. Nvidia has argued repeatedly and publicly that Jensen Huang denied Chinese military use of their chips matters less than the reality that Chinese domestic AI development has advanced to the point where Nvidia's products are not strategically necessary for China's military AI programs. The policy response to the wirescreen findings in Washington has been swift and pointed. Representative John Molinar of Michigan, chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, responded directly to the report by saying it shows that China is trying to smuggle and steal U.S. technology for military purposes. The AI Oversight Act, which would require the Commerce Department to certify that AI chips are not being used for military purposes by adversarial nations and would grant Congress the authority to block chip exports, has been put forward for a floor vote in response to the findings. The Bureau of Industry and Security issued new guidance on May 31, 2026, reinforcing that China is included in the most restricted country group for AI chip exports. But critics of the current approach argue that issuing more guidance on existing controls that have already been circumvented hundreds of times does not address the fundamental enforcement problem that the wirescreen report has exposed. The enforcement challenge that makes these export controls so difficult to make effective is worth explaining clearly because it goes beyond simple smuggling or black market operations. The most common circumvention pathway that wirescreen documented involves what security researchers call the gray channel economy, where chips flow through legitimate commercial transactions in third countries before eventually reaching Chinese military end users. A chip can be legally exported from the United States to Singapore, legally sold by a Singapore-based company to a Malaysian trading firm, and then shipped to a Chinese company that has no obvious military affiliation on paper but that in practice supplies equipment to PLA-linked universities and research institutes. Each individual transaction in that chain may appear to comply with applicable export controls, but the cumulative effect is that restricted technology reaches its intended destination. Catching and stopping these multi-hop supply chains requires intelligence and enforcement resources that the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has historically been stretched to provide. The parallel story happening inside China alongside this circumvention activity is one that American policymakers need to understand carefully, because it affects the strategic calculus of what the export controls are actually accomplishing. Even as Chinese military institutions were working to acquire Nvidia chips through the channels that wirescreen documented, Chinese domestic AI chip development has been accelerating at a pace that many Western observers underestimated. Huawei's Ascend AI accelerators have been improving with each generation, and the broader Chinese semiconductor industry has been receiving massive state investment specifically aimed at reducing dependence on American chip technology. Beijing has been so serious about this domestic development push that customs officers have reportedly been commanded to intercept H200 chips and even the RTX 5090D V2 at the border, not to comply with American export controls but to encourage Chinese AI companies to use domestic alternatives instead. The export controls are simultaneously being circumvented by military procurement networks and being used by Beijing as a justification to accelerate domestic chip development that could eventually reduce China's need for American hardware entirely. The implications of the wirescreen findings extend beyond the immediate question of Nvidia chips in Chinese military facilities into the broader debate about how technology competition between the United States and China should be managed. The export control approach that has dominated American technology policy toward China for the past several years was built on the assumption that American technological advantages in AI hardware are wide enough and durable enough that restricting Chinese access to that hardware would meaningfully constrain China's military AI development. The wirescreen report challenges both parts of that assumption. It shows that the access restriction has been far less complete than intended, and the parallel story of Chinese domestic chip development suggests that the advantage being protected may narrow over time regardless of how effective the controls are. Some American technology policy experts have argued that the export control approach should be paired with more aggressive investment in maintaining American semiconductor advantages rather than relying on restrictions alone. The commercial consequences for Nvidia of the ongoing export control situation deserve honest attention alongside the national security dimensions. Nvidia has lost access to what was one of its most lucrative markets, with estimates of annual China AI chip revenue that would have been available without export controls running into billions of dollars. The company has been forced to develop China-specific chip variants like the H20 that comply with export control thresholds while still offering meaningful AI performance to Chinese commercial customers, and even those compliant products have faced additional restrictions as American policymakers have tightened the rules. The wire screen findings create political pressure for even stricter controls that could further reduce Nvidia's ability to sell any products into China, which would have significant financial consequences for a company that has benefited enormously from the global AI infrastructure boom. The tension between American national security interests and American commercial interests in the AI chip market is one that the export control debate forces into the open in ways that are uncomfortable for both policymakers and the industry. What does all of this mean practically for the technology and geopolitical landscape going forward? The wire screen report has made it impossible to maintain the comfortable fiction that export controls have been working as intended. The 540 documented procurement attempts and the confirmed successful acquisitions through intermediary networks demonstrate that determined state actors with significant resources and motivation can find ways around technology restrictions that stop ordinary commercial buyers. That does not mean export controls have no value. The friction and cost they impose on Chinese military AI procurement is real, and the shortages they create have affected the pace of some programs. But it does mean that export controls alone are not sufficient. To address the strategic challenge, and that a more comprehensive approach including domestic investment, allied coordination, and realistic assessment of what controls can and cannot achieve is needed. The chip war between the United States and China is not a problem that can be solved by any single policy tool, and the wire screen findings are the clearest evidence yet of why. The role of allied coordination in making export controls more effective is one of the most important and underexplored dimensions of the chip war policy debate. American export controls only directly govern chips made with American technology, manufactured by American companies, or produced using American equipment. Since ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, which are essential for manufacturing the most advanced chips, are Dutch-made and use components from multiple countries, the United States has worked with the Netherlands and other allies to coordinate export restrictions. Japan has similarly implemented controls on advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment exports to China. But the wire screen report makes clear that even with this allied coordination, chips continue to reach Chinese military end users through third-country intermediaries in countries that have not adopted equivalent restrictions. Expanding the coalition of countries implementing comparable export controls and improving information sharing about circumvention networks across allied intelligence and law enforcement communities are steps that would make the current approach more effective, but they require sustained diplomatic effort and political will from partner countries that have their own commercial interests in maintaining access to Chinese markets. The long-term strategic question that the Nvidia China chip story ultimately raises is whether the United States is in a race it can win, and whether the current strategy is the right one for winning it. China's domestic semiconductor industry is developing, though it remains behind the leading edge in chip manufacturing. Chinese AI research is advancing rapidly, with domestic large language models and AI systems that compete with American counterparts. Despite operating under chip constraints,